My name is Danielle Ramsey. I'm 34. I work nights in an emergency room in Virginia. And 3 years after I buried my husband, my own mother slapped our daughter across the face at the Thanksgiving table. She called Zoe an ungrateful black kid. My father, sitting 2 chairs down, looked at my 10-year-old girl and called her ugly. I didn't scream. I picked Zoe up. I carried her out the front door. And I never let either of them back through it again. I thought that night was the end of my parents. It turned out to be the beginning of my daughter because 11 months later, the whole country would know Zoe's name, and the same two people who said she didn't belong would be standing on my porch with the warmest smiles you have ever seen, asking to be let back in. What they were really after, and what I finally did about it, is the part none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Dark Lily Stories, where ordinary people set quiet boundaries that change everything. If a family ever made you choose between keeping the peace and protecting your child, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. These days, our life is small and it is good. We rent half of a brick duplex on Lark's Lane, the kind of street where the mail comes late and everybody waves. I pick up extra shifts when the heat bill spikes. Zoe does her homework at the kitchen table under the one good lamp. And she writes, always writes with a heavy black fountain pen that used to be her father's. The nib scratches when she presses too hard, and she presses too hard when she's thinking. I learned a long time ago to be the one who doesn't break. After Nathan died, I made myself into something steady, something a little girl could lean on without it tipping over. I worked, I cooked, I signed the field trip slips, and I kept the porch light on. People at the hospital call me unflappable, and they mean it as a compliment, and I take it as one. What I didn't do for a long time was cry where she could see me. I told myself that was strength. Some of it was. Some of it was just a door I was afraid to open. We were fine. I want you to hear me say that because it's true. We were fine. The two of us in our small good life with the late mail and the scratchy pen. And then on a Tuesday in October, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. My mother's voice came through soft church music. She said she wanted to make peace before the holidays. I should have hung up. Instead, I said maybe. I met Nathan Cole in a hospital hallway, which is a terrible place to fall in love, and the only place I ever managed it. He'd brought a student to the ER with a broken wrist and stayed 4 hours just to make sure the kid wasn't scared. He taught high school English. He believed with his whole chest that the right sentence could hold a person together. He used to tell Zoe when she was tiny and afraid of the dark that words are how you stay, that the people we love keep living as long as we keep saying them out loud. He read everything twice and wrote in the margins in tiny, careful print. His favorite book was a battered paperback novel, the spine taped over, every other page crowded with his handwriting. When I married him, my parents came to the wedding. They wore their good clothes and their thin smiles. My mother did not appear in a single photograph beside him. My father shook his hand like he was returning something he'd been asked to hold. Afterward, in the church parking lot, my mother took my elbow and said quietly that there would be a price for this someday, and that she hoped I'd remember she'd warned me. I thought she meant gossip. I thought she meant her bridge club on a few cold Sundays. I had no idea she was already looking past me, past the man I loved, at a child who didn't even exist yet, and deciding in advance that she would never be hers. Nathan was killed 3 years ago on an ordinary Thursday by a man who hated him for nothing more than the color of his skin. I am not going to walk you through that night. You don't need the details, and Zoe will never get them from me. What matters is that she was 8, and that she lost the person who taught her that words are how you stay, and that I had to decide in about 4 seconds what kind of mother the rest of her childhood was going to get. I decided she would get a steady one. I planned the service. I called the school. I went back to work in 11 days because the bills did not pause to grieve along with us. I held everything so tightly that my hands ached at night, and I told myself that was love, and most of it was. But here is the thing I didn't see, the thing I'd give a great deal to go back and notice. While I was busy being the wall that doesn't fall, My daughter was quietly learning to carry her own grief in a way no 8-year-old should ever have to. She stopped asking about her dad out loud. She got very, very quiet. And I, a woman who can spot a dropping blood pressure from across a crowded room, somehow did not notice that my little girl had started keeping something all to herself behind a closed bedroom door in the long hours after I'd kissed her goodnight. Let me tell you about my family, because you'll need to understand them to understand what they did. My mother, Carol, is 62 and has spent her whole life inside a tight circle of church committees and women who measure each other by their casseroles. For 20 years, she ran the Ladies' Auxiliary at Grace Fellowship like a small, grateful kingdom. When I married Nathan, that kingdom went cold on her. A friend of 30 years stopped returning her calls. She was passed over for the spring committee she'd chaired since I was in middle school. Nobody said why. They didn't have to. In my mother's mind, she had paid an enormous price for my choices, and the bill kept arriving every Sunday in the shape of the empty seats beside her. My father, Ray, is 64 and calls himself a realist, which is the word careful men use when they don't want to say the truth. He never raised his voice about Nathan. He just stopped mentioning him the way you stop mentioning whether you'd rather not have. And then there's my older sister, Megan, 38, who has built an entire little online brand out of looking like the perfect family, and who has never once forgiven me for the year her future in-laws whispered about the Ramsey girl who married outside her kind. So when my mother called that October and said soft as church music that she only wanted to make peace, she wasn't speaking just for herself. Every one of those people was sitting in the room with her. I simply didn't know it yet. Zoe at 11 is the quietest, interesting person I know. She reads the way other kids breathe. She has her father's paperback nearly memorized, the way you memorize a face. And she started circling his margin notes in pencil, adding tiny question marks beside the ones she doesn't understand yet, like she's having a slow conversation with him through the pages. Her teacher pulled me aside at conferences. So did Ms. Harmon, the school librarian, who told me with a strange catch in her voice that Zoe had written a single paragraph about loss that made her step into the hallway after reading it. I said, "Thank you," and I meant it. And I also changed the subject because that's what I did with anything that pressed on the bruise. One night that fall, Zoe looked up from the kitchen table and asked me plainly whether her dad had ever met her grandparents. I said yes at the wedding. She asked if they had liked him. I rinsed a glass that was already clean. I told her grown-ups are complicated, which is the cowardly answer, and she let me have it because she is kind. Then she asked the question that should have stopped me from getting a cold. She asked very simply if her grandparents would like her. And I, God help me, said, of course they would. I wanted it to be true so badly that the wanting drowned out 3 years of knowing better. I booked a flight for Thanksgiving the very next week. I want to be honest about why I said yes, because I've had a year to sit with it. It wasn't that I trusted them. I'm not a naive woman. I'd had 3 years of silence to learn exactly who my parents were. It was that I am the kind of person who finishes what she's responsible for. And somewhere deep down, I decided that giving Zoe a family was my job, even if I had to build one out of people who didn't deserve her. My gut told me not to go. I overruled my gut with a to-do list. I called my mother back and I set conditions plainly, the way I'd set them with a difficult patient. No comments about Zoe's hair. No comments about her father. One dinner and we leave the second anyone makes her uncomfortable. My mother agreed to every word in that soft voice. She said she just wanted her granddaughter at her table. I packed Zoe's nicest dress and her father's paperback because she didn't travel anywhere without it. I keep replaying the moment I said yes to that dinner. If you've ever talked yourself out of your own instincts just to keep peace with family, you already know the exact weight of that drive. Stay with me. What happened at that table is the reason this whole story exists. And if it's pulling you in already, do me one small favor and hit subscribe so the ending doesn't get lost in your feed. My parents' house in the Richmond suburb still smells like lemon polish and holds breath. My mother met us at the door with an embrace that touched nothing. She looked at Zoe's braids for 1/2 second too long, then said brightly that she'd hoped Zoe might wear her hair down. I reminded her evenly of our very first condition. She laughed it off like I'd told a joke. Inside the table was already a performance, the good china. My sister Megan filmed a little video of the centerpiece for her followers. Megan's two kids running the hall with that holiday electricity. Zoe set her father's paperback beside her plate, the way some children keep a hand on a parent's sleeve. My mother glanced at it and murmured, just loud enough. Was she still carrying that ratty old thing around? Zoe's hand went flat on the cover. The only real warmth in the house came from my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, who crouched down to Zoe's eye level, asked her seriously what she was reading, and then actually listened to the answer. I let myself exhale. One dinner. We could do one dinner. Then Megan's youngest spotted the small carved wooden horse Zoe had been turning over in her hands. Her father had whittled it for her when she was 6 and decided he wanted it. The horse was the smallest thing in that whole house. By the time the pie came out, it was the loudest. Here's how small it really was. Megan's son, who is 6 and used to getting his way, grabbed the wooden horse off the table. Zoe asked for it back politely twice. He held it over his head and laughed. So Zoe stood up and took it back the way any child on earth would take back the last thing her dead father ever made for her. The boy howled like he'd been struck. And my mother, who had not said one cross word to her grandson all evening, turned the full weight of her attention onto my daughter. She told Zoe in front of everyone that a guest does not snatch. Zoe said quietly that it was hers, that her daddy made it. My mother's face did something I had seen exactly once before in a church parking lot 11 years earlier. She said that the child needs to learn her place in this house. Megan kept filming the centerpiece and pretended not to hear. My father studied his plate like it held instructions. Aunt Diane started to rise, and inside me the old steadiness hardened into something colder and clearer than I've ever felt at any bedside. I set down my fork. I said, "Mom, that's enough. We talked about this. I honestly thought a single sentence would be enough. I have replayed what came next more times than I can count, and I still wasn't fast enough to stop it." My mother stood up. She crossed behind Zoe's chair before I was even out of mine, and she slapped my 10-year-old daughter across the face hard enough that the sound stopped the entire table. Hard enough that the wooden horse fell out of Zoe's hand and clattered across the floor. Then she screamed, "You ungrateful black kid!" The words came out of her like they had been waiting 11 years for the door to open. And my father, my quiet, realist father, looked at my daughter's stunned, greening face, and what he reached for in that silence was not an apology. He said, half under his breath, the way a man names a fact about the weather, that he'd told my mother, "No good ever comes of raising an ugly little black girl with no manners." Megan's phone was still up. Her own kids had gone dead silent. Aunt Diane said Carol's name like a slap of her own. And me. I did not scream, though every cell in my body was built to. I have spent my whole adult life staying calm while the worst things happen to the people I love. And that training is the only reason I did not put my hand through that china cabinet. I stood up. I walked around the table. I bent down and picked the little wooden horse up off the floor. And then I picked up my daughter. And in the dead quiet of that dining room, my mother looked at me. And for the first time in her life, she seemed afraid. I did not say very much. People expect a scene in a moment like that. And I think part of my mother was braced for one because a screaming match is a thing she knows how to win. I didn't give her one. I held Zoe against my hip. She's 10 and tall, but she folded into me like she was 5, and I picked up her father's paperback from beside her plate, and I held the wooden horse in the same hand, and I walked us toward the front door. Aunt Diane followed me into the hall with our coats, her hands shaking, whispering that she was so sorry that she should have stopped it sooner. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for, and I meant it, and I made sure to say it where my mother could hear which apology in that house was the real one. At the door, my mother had found her voice again. She called after me that I was overreacting, that family forgives, that I'd regret making a scene over nothing. I turned around with my hand flat on the knob. I told her very quietly that she would never speak to my daughter again as long as she lived. "Either of you," I said. and I looked straight at my father when I said it. Then I opened the door and carried Zoe out into the cold, and I genuinely believed I was closing the book on those two people for good. I had the right idea. I just had the wrong book. We drove the 4 hours home that night instead of staying over. Zoe didn't cry. That's the part that scared me most, honestly. I'm an ER nurse. I know that the quiet ones are the ones you watch. She held the wooden horse in both hands the whole way and looked out the window at the dark interstate. Around hour 3, she asked me without turning her head whether what Grandma said was true. I pulled the car onto the shoulder. I turned all the way around in my seat so she could see my whole face, because some things you cannot say to the back of a child's head. I told her that her grandmother had said something cruel and false, that her father was the finest man I'd ever known, that being his daughter was the best thing about her and not the worst. I told her she was not ungrateful, and she was not ugly, and she never ever had to earn her place at any table on this earth. She listened. She nodded. She still didn't cry. When we got home, she went straight to her room, and I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and finally let myself shake. The next morning, I blocked my mother's number. My father's and Megan's, one after another. I told myself I had handled it, and I almost missed it. The light still on under Zoe's door long past midnight, and the faint scratch of a heavy fountain pen pressed too hard against the page. The weeks after were strange and quiet. Zoe went to school, came home, did her homework, and then she wrote. Not the way kids dash off an assignment. She wrote the way her father read completely somewhere I couldn't follow. She filled one spiral notebook and started another. I'd come home from a night shift and find her at the kitchen table, the lamp on, the pen scratching, the paperback open beside her like a reference she kept checking against. I assumed it was a school project. I assumed because assuming was easier than asking, and because a small, fearful part of me worried that if I asked what she was writing about, the answer would be that night. And I didn't think I could hold us both up if she handed me that. So, I gave her space. I refilled the ink when it ran dry. I left a plate of toast by her elbow and didn't hover. I almost knocked on her door to ask a dozen times, and I am so glad now that I didn't. Because what she was building in that notebook is the entire reason you are sitting here watching this. We're coming up on the part where the whole country found out what an 11-year-old can do with a fountain pen and grief. She flatly refused to keep quiet. If you've got a kid who turns their pain into something they make with their hands, tell me about them in the comments, and subscribe because the turn is close now, and I really don't want you to miss it. It was a Sunday in January when I found it. Zoe was at a friend's house. I was stripping her bed to wash the sheets, and the second notebook had slid down into the gap between the mattress and the wall. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that even now. I picked it up to set it on her desk, and the cover fell open, and I saw the first line, and after that, I could not stop. It wasn't a school project. It was a book, a whole finished hand-printed book, 60 pages about a girl whose father taught her that words keep people alive, and who lost him far too young, and who got told by the people who were supposed to love her most that she didn't belong. She hadn't used their names. She'd written simply about the people who looked at her and saw the wrong color instead of their own granddaughter. And on the first page, where a book puts its dedication, she had copied out a single line in her careful print, the very same line written in her father's hand in the margin of that battered paperback, the line he had left there for her years before either of us knew he was running out of time. Words are how you stay. I sat down on her half-stripped bed and read all 60 pages, and I finally did the crying I'd been putting off for 3 solid years. My 8-year-old had buried her father in silence. My 11-year-old had just written him all the way back to life. And I understood, holding that notebook in my lap, that the only real question left wasn't whether the world would ever read this. It was whether I was brave enough to let it. I asked Zoe about it that night. Gently, the notebook resting in my lap. I told her I'd found it, that I hadn't meant to, and that it was the most beautiful thing I had ever read. She got very still, the way she does, and then she asked if I was angry that she'd written about Grandma. I told her she could write about anything that was true. Then I asked her the only question that mattered. Did she want anyone else to read it? She thought about it for a long time. She said her dad used to tell her that a story you keep in a drawer can't help anybody. So the next week I took it to Ms. Harmon, the librarian, because I didn't know where else to begin, and because she was the one who'd had to step into the hallway. Ms. Harmon read it in one sitting at her desk after school. And when she finished, she took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes and said, "We don't usually do this, but this needs to be read by more than me." She knew a woman who ran a small independent press 2 counties over, the kind that prints 400 copies of local poetry and feels lucky to do it. We didn't have grand plans. We just had 60 pages of the truth and a little girl who decided not to leave them in a drawer. I told myself it would stay small. I have never in my life been so completely wrong about anything. The little press wanted to publish it almost exactly as she'd written it. Her words, her hand-drawn pictures, the dedication untouched. They took the title straight from a line in the text. The Words We Keep. Zoe spent her evenings that spring inking the final drawings with her father's pen, pressing too hard, the way she always does. The first copies arrived in a cardboard carton that smelled like fresh paper, and Zoe held one for a long time without saying a word, and then she said quietly that it felt like he was holding it too. The press set up a reading at our county library on a Saturday in May. Maybe 40 people came: neighbors, 2 teachers, Ms. Harmon, and a reporter from the weekly paper who mostly covered the farmers market. Zoe stood on a step stool behind the podium because she couldn't see over it otherwise, and she read the last chapter in a clear, small voice that did not shake even once, which is more than I can say for a single adult in that room. Somebody filmed it on a phone, a grainy 9-second clip of an 11-year-old reading about her murdered father, ending on that dedication, her chin up, the library lights catching her face. They posted it that night with a couple of lines about a local girl in her book. By the time I woke up for my Sunday shift, it had been watched 2,000 times. By the time I clocked out 12 hours later, it was past 1 million. What happens to a family when a phone won't stop ringing is that you learn very fast who you can trust. A literary agent called on Monday. A real publisher, a big one, a name you would know, called on Wednesday. Suddenly, there were contracts thick as phone books with numbers in them that had too many zeros for a duplex on Lark's Lane. So, I did the thing I always do when I'm out of my depth. I found someone smarter than me, and I listened. A lawyer named Patricia Vaughn, who'd handled estates for half the county, sat me down and walked me through every single page. She helped me set up a trust so that every dollar Zoe earned was locked away for Zoe with me as the sole trustee and her only legal guardian, the way her father and I had always meant it to be. I signed those papers on a humid Thursday, not really understanding yet that they were anything more than tax paperwork. I understand now. Those signatures and the plain legal fact that I alone spoke for my daughter and her work would turn out to be the only thing standing between Zoe's name and the 2 people who had once told her she didn't deserve to share it. But that was still months away. In May, all I knew was that my quiet girl had written something true, that the truth had jumped its banks and flooded the whole country, and that somewhere out in the suburbs of Richmond, a phone I had blocked was lighting up with the news. By June, The Words We Keep was on every bestseller list that matters. Zoe got invited onto one of the big national morning shows, the kind my mother used to tape every single day of my childhood. I almost said no. Then Zoe said she wanted to do it for her dad, and that settled it for both of us. They sat her in a tall chair under hot lights, and a kind-eyed host asked her where the book had come from. Zoe told the country simply that her father had taught her that words are how you stay, and that she'd written the book so that he'd never have to leave. Then she read the dedication out loud. 11 years old, feet not touching the floor, reading the line her father had once left for her in the margin of a paperback. The host wiped her eyes on live television. The clip went everywhere. Words are how you stay became a thing people wrote on cards and painted on walls and read aloud at funerals of their own. Strangers mailed Zoe drawings. A teacher in Ohio sent a photo of the whole sentence stenciled above her classroom door. My daughter, who 11 months earlier had been slapped at a dinner table and called a thing I will not repeat again, was now a name the whole country knew and a comfort to people she would never meet. And then on a Tuesday, my phone, silent for the better part of a year, lit up with a name I had blocked the night I carried her out that front door. It didn't come straight from my mother. She's never been one to risk a closed door. It came sideways, the way she has always worked. First, it was a voicemail from Aunt Diane, uneasy, saying Carol had been asking around for my new number. Then, it was a card in the mail, my mother's looping handwriting, congratulating us on Zoe's wonderful success and saying how proud the whole family was. Proud. I read that word standing at my mailbox on Lark's Lane, and I actually laughed out loud. One short, ugly bark of a laugh because the last expression I'd seen on that woman's face was contempt, and the last word she'd aimed at my daughter still lived in my chest like a splinter. Then Megan found me, not with an apology, but with a direct message on the very same account where she'd once filmed her perfect centerpiece while her mother struck my child. She wrote that it broke her heart, all this distance, that family should celebrate together, that surely I wouldn't keep Zoe from her grandparents at a time like this. She used the word grandparents 3 separate times. She did not use the word sorry even once. I didn't answer any of them. I told myself they'd give up and go away. And they might have. They really might have if I hadn't gotten a very different phone call 2 days later from my publisher that told me exactly what my family had actually been after the whole time. My editor's name is Joanne, and she does not rattle. So when Joanne called and said very carefully that she wanted to check something with me, I sat down. She said the publicity team had been contacted several times by people identifying themselves as Zoe's grandparents. These people had a story. They said they had helped raise Zoe. They said they'd encouraged her writing from the very start. One of them had hinted delicately that the father's side of the family wasn't really in the picture and had asked whether there might be a way for the grandparents to be involved in the book's promotion and whether such involvement might be. The word they used was compensated. Joanne said she'd held off because something about it felt wrong. I told her exactly how wrong. I told her about the dinner. I told her what my mother had screamed and what my father had said, and the sound a slap makes in a quiet room. There was a long pause on the line, and then Joanne said in a flat, hard voice that she was very glad she had called me first. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and felt the last of my confusion burn off into something clean and cold. They didn't want to apologize. They had never, not for 1 second, wanted to apologize. They wanted to stand in the light my daughter had made, and they wanted to be paid for the privilege, and they had been telling perfect strangers that they were the ones who built it. I found out later that Megan had tracked down our address through a mutual cousin. All I knew that Saturday afternoon was that a car I didn't recognize pulled up outside the duplex, and my mother and father climbed out of it in their good clothes. My mother carried a bouquet, grocery store lies still in the plastic sleeve, and a wrapped gift with a bow. My father stood a step behind her, hands in his pockets, not quite looking at the house. I went out onto the porch and pulled the front door most of the way shut behind me so that Zoe, inside at the kitchen table with her pen, would stay exactly where she was. My mother's whole face was arranged into warmth. She said my name like the first note of a hymn. She said, "Oh, honey, look how well you've done, both of you," and held the lilies out across the threshold toward me. I didn't take them. I stood on my own porch on the lease I pay for with night shifts, and I felt no urge to scream and no urge to cry. I just felt the steadiness, the real kind this time, the kind that knows exactly where its own front door is and exactly who is allowed through it. I told her she could leave the flowers on the step. I told her she could not come in. My father finally lifted his eyes to me. My mother's smile held, but something behind it had already begun rehearsing a very different speech. My mother is nothing if not prepared. When the warmth didn't get her through the door, she pivoted smoothly to the speech she'd actually come to give. She said, "Families forgive." She said it had been a hard few years for everyone, as though we'd all lost something equal. She said Zoe had grandparents who loved her, and that I had no right to keep that from a child. Then she got to the real thing, smooth as butter. She said there was so much attention on the book now, so many wonderful opportunities, and that it would mean the world to the family to be part of it, to stand beside Zoe publicly as the proud grandparents they truly were. My father added quietly that it wouldn't look right now, would it? The whole world finding out Zoe's own family wasn't even around. And there it was, the threat wrapped in cheap lilies. Be useful to us in public, or we will make your silence look like cruelty. I could hear my sister's brand speak in the phrasing. Megan had clearly coached them line by line. For 1 second, the old reflex flickered, the worry about how it would look, the trained fear of being the difficult one. Then it passed completely, and what rose up in its place was very calm and very clear. Threaten me all you like, I thought, but you just threatened her story. Now you have my full attention. I didn't argue with them on the porch. Arguing is a game my mother has gone undefeated at for 62 years, and I had no intention of playing on her field. I just said no. Not an angry no, a closed one. I told them there would be no public appearances, no proud grandparents, no involvement of any kind now or ever, and that the next time they contacted my daughter's publisher pretending to have raised her, my lawyer would be the one to call them back. My mother's mouth fell open. I stepped inside and shut the door before she could find her next sentence. Then I did 3 quiet things. I called Patricia Vaughn, my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew in my bones. As sole guardian and trustee, I controlled every aspect of Zoe's work and her earnings. Full stop. And not one grandparent on this earth had any standing to touch a single page of it. I called Joanne and told her that anyone phoning to claim they were family spoke for no one but themselves. And I called Aunt Diane, who had been at that table, who had tried to stand up. And before I could even ask, she told me that if it ever came to it, she would tell anyone, anywhere exactly what she had seen with her own eyes. I wasn't going to fight my parents. I was going to let the truth do that for me. I just never expected the truth would get its chance on a stage in front of a crowd with the cameras already rolling. The library where Zoe had read from a step stool a year earlier wanted to host her again. A real event this time to celebrate the book that had started on their own little stage. There'd be a few hundred people, the mayor and a regional television crew shooting a feel-good segment for the evening news. Zoe was nervous and proud and asked me to iron the green dress. I said yes to all of it because it was hers, because she had earned it, because a girl who'd turned her grief into a gift for strangers deserved to stand in a room that loved her. What I did not know was that my sister Megan had already called the station's producer. She had presented herself as the family liaison. She had told them that Zoe's grandparents would be attending to support their granddaughter. And wouldn't that be a touching moment for the camera? 3 generations, the proud family behind the little author. The producer thought it was a lovely angle. Megan made sure my parents had the date, the time, and 2 seats saved in the front row. They were coming whether I wanted them there or not, dressed for a warmth they had never once shown, ready to be filmed loving a child they had struck. I found all of this out about 40 minutes before it happened from a voicemail Aunt Diane left in a panic. 40 minutes isn't enough time to cancel a televised event, and even if it had been, the producer had already bought my sister's version whole. My word against 3 smiling relatives would have looked like exactly the petty family feud Megan needed it to look like. I thought about calling backstage to warn Zoe and decided against it. I was not going to hand my daughter fear right before the biggest night of her life. And there was one more reason, the truest one. And I'm not proud of how calm it felt. A private accusation is just noise. Her word against theirs behind closed doors forever. But these 2 had begged a television station to film them standing next to her. If they wanted a camera that badly, I was going to let them have one. So when I finally understood what they were walking into, the cold, clear thing in my chest did not panic at all. It thought very simply, good. Let every single person in that room see them. The library's community room was full by 6 o'clock. They'd set out folding chairs in long rows, then run out of folding chairs and let people stand along the walls. There was a small riser with a podium that Zoe could finally see over a long table stacked with copies of The Words We Keep, and the regional news crew setting up a camera on a tripod near the front. Zoe wore a green dress. She carried two things up to that podium: her father's battered paperback, spine taped over, his handwriting crowded in the margins, and the heavy black fountain pen she'd inked every drawing with. She set the paper back on the podium the same way she had once set it beside her dinner plate. I sat in the second row with Aunt Diane beside me because Diane had driven 3 hours to be there, and because I wanted at least one person from that family in the room who had actually chosen my daughter. Ms. Harmon was there. Half of Lark's Lane was there. For about 20 minutes, it was perfect. It was everything I had ever wanted for my quiet girl. A whole room leaned toward her, waiting to be let into the thing she had made. And then I saw two familiar figures making their way up the side aisle toward the empty front row seats my sister had saved. My mother in her pearls, my father in his church jacket, both of them already smiling, the warm, wide smiles of people who have come to be seen loving someone. They didn't see me at first, or else they pretended not to. My mother settled into the front row directly in the camera's eye line and arranged her face into grandmotherly joy. Megan slipped in beside them and gave a little wave toward the producer, a gesture there they are gesture. And I watched the producer nod and angle the camera a few degrees to keep the proud family in frame. It was choreographed. It was going to be a beautiful 60 seconds on the evening news, the celebrated child author and the loving grandparents who had stood behind her all along. And it would be a live broadcast to half the state. And once it aired, it would be the version that stuck. My mother caught my eye across the rows, and her smile didn't flicker. It sharpened the way it does when she believes she's already won. She gave me a small, knowing nod, as if we were partners in this, as if I would surely understand that family close as ranks in front of cameras. Up at the podium, Zoe was thanking Miss Harmon and the little press, reading from a few index cards in her clear, small voice. She hadn't spotted them yet. I had maybe a minute before she did. And then my mother, impatient for her moment, did the thing that ended all of it. She stood up mid-event and started moving toward the riser, her arms already opening, reaching for my daughter's shoulder like she had owned it all along. I was up and out of my seat before I decided to be. I'm fast on my feet. 12 years of codes and crashing patience will do that to a person. And I reached the riser a half step ahead of her and put myself calmly between my mother and my child. I didn't grab her. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there steady and said quietly that she needed to go sit back down. The room had gone curious and still. The camera was rolling. And my mother, who had rehearsed warmth all week, discovered in that instant that she could not get past me, and the warmth fell off her face like a dropped plate. She said loud enough now for the front rows to hear that I was making a scene, that she was Zoe's grandmother, and she had every right. I said evenly, "No, you don't." And that was the spark. Whatever she had been holding behind that smile for a year came up all at once and in front of 200 people and a television camera. My mother hissed that after everything she had sacrificed, that child should be grateful. There was that word again, the very same one she'd screamed across the Thanksgiving table. That ungratefulness was exactly what she had always been. The room heard every syllable. You could feel the temperature in it change, the leaning toward turning all at once into a leaning away. My father reached for my mother's sleeve, and for one strange second, his face was not a realist's mask at all. He'd read the book, I learned later, read it twice, and something in him cracked clean through. But when my mother yanked her arm free and demanded that they leave, he went with her. Because going with her is the only thing he has ever reliably done. And as the two of them turned for the aisle, Aunt Diane stood up in the second row in front of everyone and said in a voice that shook but did not stop, "I was there last Thanksgiving. I saw exactly what these two did to this little girl. Don't you let them tell you otherwise." My mother spun back around, and now the tears came, the fast theatrical tears I had watched her summon my entire childhood. And she cried out to the room that this was all a misunderstanding, that I had poisoned everyone against her, that she loved that child. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing I had come there ready to say, and I said it quietly, because quiet was the loudest thing left in that room. You don't get to be proud of her now. I told them plainly for everyone to hear that they had called my daughter ungrateful and ugly, and worse, that they had struck her at a family table when she was 10 years old, and that they had spent the last month telling this child's own publisher they'd raised her so that they could be paid for a success they had once tried to crush. I told the room that I was her only guardian and her only voice, that not one word of her book and not $1 of her work would ever pass through their hands, and that the family Zoe could actually count on was already sitting in this room. My mother had no second act for the truth. She looked around for an ally and found a sea of strangers who had quietly, completely made up their minds. My father would not lift his eyes from the floor. And then they did the only thing left for them to do. They walked out the way they had walked in, smiling at no one, except now no one in that whole room was smiling back. The camera caught all of it. They had come to be filmed being loved. They left being filmed as exactly who they were. And here's the part I will keep for the rest of my life. Through all of it, Zoe had stayed at the podium, very still, both hands flat on her father's paperback. When the doors finally swung shut behind my parents, she didn't cry, and she didn't crumble. She waited for the room to settle. Then she leaned into the microphone and said in that clear, small voice that she wanted to read one more thing, the dedication. She opened the front cover. She read the line her father had left for her in the margin years before. The line that was now printed in the front of a book the whole country had taken into its arms. Words are how you stay. She said her dad had told her that, and that it was true, and that it worked for the good people too. That as long as we keep saying the names of the ones who loved us out loud and right, they never really leave us. The room came apart in the best possible way. People stood. Some of them were openly weeping. The producer, I noticed, had quietly swung the camera away from the empty front row seats and back toward the little girl in the green dress, which is exactly where it should have been pointed all along. I sat in the second row beside the aunt who had chosen us, and I did not feel triumphant. Not exactly. I felt like a door had finally quietly latched shut, and that on the right side of it stood every single person who mattered. The segment that aired that night was not the one my sister had pitched. The station ran 90 honest seconds of a girl reading a dedication to her murdered father, and not one single frame of grandparents. Somebody in that room had filmed my mother's outburst too. And that clip found its own small audience the way these things do, enough that the people in her tight little church circle finally saw with their own eyes the woman behind the casseroles. The proud family story died the same day it was born. Megan took her perfect family brand quiet for a long while. There isn't much of a market for it once the footage exists. My parents got exactly what they had built, and nothing they had come for. I didn't sue them. I didn't post about them. I didn't have to. They stood in the light my daughter made and showed the whole room their own shadow. And the truth, once it's loose in a room like that, does the rest of the work on its own. Patricia sent one short letter making the legal boundaries permanent. After that, there was only silence from Richmond. The good kind this time, the kind I chose. Life on Lark's Lane went back to being small and good, just with a few more copies of a certain book in the world. Zoe still writes at the kitchen table under the one good lamp, still presses her father's pen too hard, still keeps the taped-up paperback within arm's reach. My father mailed a letter a few months later, an actual apology in his careful hand. The first true words he'd ever sent me. I read it once. I didn't answer it. Some doors you can stand at quietly with no anger left in you at all and still choose to keep closed. That is the part it took me 34 years to learn. That closing a door isn't always slamming it. Sometimes it's just deciding calmly who gets to come in. These days, when I shut our front door at night and turn the lock, it doesn't feel like running from anyone. It feels like home with everyone who belongs already inside it. If there's one thing I'd carry out of all of this, it's that family was never the blood that demands your silence. It's the people who help you find your voice and who choose again and again and out loud to stay. That's my story. One slap at a holiday table. 11 months of silence, and a quiet little girl who turned her grief into words the whole country needed to hear. If this reminded you that protecting your child is never the wrong choice, take it as your sign to hold your own boundary today. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.